Hey, Julian here. If you're a regular listener, you might remember a story that we did last year about scammer farms. Most scams these days, they're being run by people living in slavery from these so-called scammer farms, and it's a pretty scary, bleak situation. So we've launched a new multi-part documentary series called Scammerland. You're going to hear some stories of people who have been abducted into this system and then escaped. And then we're going to really unpack how this business model got started, who runs it, and who is trying to stop it. It's on Apple Podcasts, but it's also on YouTube and Spotify if you'd like to watch the video version. That's Scammerland, out now.
Super real.
Hey, I'm Julian Morgans, and you're listening to What It Was Like, the show that asks people who have lived through big, dramatic events what it was like. Two weeks ago, we did a story on Belle Gibson, the Australian influencer and app creator who was exposed for fraud. And since then, I've received a whole bunch of messages from listeners asking, hey, why don't you get a fraudster on the show? Everyone's suggested that I talk to someone who has personally served some jail time for fraud, someone who can explain what was happening in their head as they lied and stole money. And it's a great idea, but here's the thing. Over the years, I've reached out to so many white-collar criminals asking them to come on the show, but every time it's a dead end. Either they just don't respond, or if they do, it's only to claim that they're innocent and it's all a big misunderstanding, blah, blah, blah. But today's episode, it's something special, because finally today, I'm going to sit down with someone who not only went to prison for fraud, but is willing to unpack her story completely honestly. Her name is Kari Ferrell, and she became known as the Hipster Grifter in New York City back in the late 2000s. Her MO, picking up rich, young men in Manhattan bars, going home with them, and then stealing their cash and possessions. And to be clear, Kari didn't profit much from this. It was mostly about the thrill of the chase. But then she got outed in a few viral articles in Vice and Gawker, and this kind of framed her as this twisted Robin Hood, stealing from the city's trust fund hipsters as like a form of protest, really, at racism and the patriarchy. Kari was born in South Korea and adopted by American parents, then raised in a strict Mormon household in Utah. So this unique background really informed her behavior. So let's do it. Let's dive into the fascinating psychology of fraud with someone who's lived it. Here is Kari Ferrell. Kari, welcome to the show.
Hi, Julian. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for joining me. We're going to jump kind of midway just into your story. And I want to know, what was your first experience of lying?
The first that I remember was being asked, when I was a child, how school was. And, just saying, yeah, it was fine. Everything was great. Moving on. When in fact, everything was not great. And school was a very arduous experience for me, like many others. But, I experienced a lot of bullying, teasing, things like that. So I remember one time my parents asked and I brushed it off and I was like, oh, wow, I can do this. I don't have to dig into this every day. I can just get them off my back by saying, yeah, all good. And yeah, just moving forward from there.
Okay, well, that's childhood. So sort of using that type of behavior as stepping stones. Do you want to take me through a few other memories where you were just sort of experimenting in your earlier years of just kind of manipulating people a little bit?
Yeah. For me, a lot of the manipulation was around, looking for understanding and belonging. And it obviously, I was going about it in a very skewed manner, but I would lie to, appear cooler or friendlier or more interesting. And I think the The fascinating part of it for me is that my story in and of itself was interesting enough, but I never felt that way. And so the things that I was lying about, they were so stupid. It was like lying about having an Xbox, lying about having, just ways to make me feel and appear to have more than I did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of kids do that. A lot of kids, they're like, my dad owns McDonald's, or,
Right.
some classic nonsense like that. So I don't think that's unusual.
Yeah, I think where it maybe started to get a bit more unusual in my case is when I realized how well that worked, and how well the lying and the manipulation, for my purposes, again, getting people to be interested in my life and diverting that attention to the things I wanted them to be interested in. Like, I'm an adopted person, so I never really wanted to talk about that. Things have changed now, but at the time, that was the least important, exciting, facet of my existence. And I just wanted to move on. I wanted to be like, no, I'm like everyone else. I'm like you. And so as I started to lie and I saw, I guess, for all intents and purposes for me, the positive results of that, it just kept going and it snowballed. I was getting to the point where I was lying about things where it was like, that's literally impossible. That's like, that's not feasible. Where it's
Sure.
like, no, we know your dad. Like, your dad is friends with our dad. Like, he does not
Yeah.
own a McDonald's. Yeah.
Yeah. So what sort of period, when you kind of hit like adolescent peak lying, what was happening in your life at the time?
Oh, what was unique is, again, I'm adopted. I'm Korean American. I was raised in Salt Lake City, Utah, which is Mormon Mecca. I was raised within the Church of Latter-day Saints, and I was really one of the only people who looked like me. Certainly within my high school, but even, I mean, realistically within the state. And I think that people feel like when I say these things, it's hyperbolic. But if I pull up, my, high school yearbook and you flip through the pages, you're like, oh, no, you were like one of two. And the other Asian person at the school was also adopted. So it was this lack of culture, both my own culture and then the culture around me. And all of that being said, I just didn't know who I was. And so I was always sort of shedding and, reapplying different layers to myself. And again, that's not something that a lot of people do that, but I would bounce from friend group to friend group, oh, maybe I'm a punk. And so I was just constantly trying to be the person that I thought everyone else needed me to be.
Yeah, you're trying to fit in, but
I was just trying to fit in.
like turbo fitting in though.
Turbo fitting in. And yeah, a lot of the exploration was also like, well, how far can I push this? What is good? What is evil? And, where do those limits exist if they do?
Yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways, you're describing fairly normal sort of adolescent developmental stuff. And I think the next step in the story is pretty normal as well. Like you started getting into shoplifting, which is a kind of a classic thing for young women, particularly.
Yeah, it's the classic. It's because in a way, it feels like a safe crime, and we made a game out of it because at a certain point, stealing things just to steal them wasn't fun enough. It was like, oh, I want this thing. I'm going to go get this thing. And then you have the thing and it's like, great. But I have always been a collector of experiences. And so it was like, okay, well, how do we make this better? And so we sort of developed Scumbag Olympics, which is, it was the idea of like, okay, we're going to go to the store and we have a contest. It's who can steal the most expensive thing, the least expensive thing, the largest item, the smallest item. And so we would literally go out to these different stores and try to get a quote unquote winning item, and then all go back and share those things with each other. And whoever won the challenge got to keep all of the things.
Okay, so how did you graduate from shoplifting and get into writing bad checks?
Great question. And if you have the answer or discover that, please let me know. You can bill me for your therapeutic services.
Okay.
Really, again, it was a form of, again, seeking acceptance. And it sounds so wacky. And I'm sure there will be plenty of listeners who are just like, yeah, what the fuck is she talking about? Like, this is crazy. But really, I mean, you look at things like the book, How to Make Friends and Influence People. And what that book talks about and what they teach in, business classes around the world is that when you ingratiate yourself to someone, when you're asking someone for help, that really kind of solidifies this relationship with them. And so I started by writing these bad checks. And I don't know what your average listener demographic is, but checks are these pieces of paper that were blank, and you could literally write any amount, any number, and say that you had that money, whether or not you did. Amazingly stupid as a concept. And so not only that, but then it would take several days, if not weeks, for the banks to realize, oh, that amount of money that you said that you had doesn't actually exist. And so I would go to friends and I would say, hey, listen, I'm having this issue with my bank. I don't know why, but I can't take money out of the ATM. However, for whatever reason, I'm able to write checks. And so if I can write this check to you and you cash it, I would be so beyond grateful. Not only would I be grateful, but I will give you, $100, $200, whatever, for helping me out, and then also take you to dinner. And so I was building this world in which people wanted to help me because initially they were my friends. And that's by far one of the most fucked up things about all of this is it would have been bad regardless of who I was targeting. But it began with people who actually wanted to help me because they actually cared about me because they were my actual friends. And
you were screwing over your friends.
Yeah, I was screwing over my friends. I mean, the people who were the closest to me. And, obviously they were the people who never considered that I would ever be lying to them when I'm, spouting off this ridiculous story about my bank.
So I understand that the first person that you wrote a bad check for was actually your boyfriend at the time.
Yes.
Can you just take me through that story?
Yeah. So this guy definitely did not deserve any of the things that I did to him, but he was a legitimate boyfriend. I mean, we dated for a very long time and, we thought that we were in love, and we were sitting in his bedroom in this house that he was living in with his bandmates. That's the other thing. He was in a band. So I remember we were sitting in his bedroom, which was next to the practice space that they had in their basement. Cool. So I do recall that during this conversation, it was so loud. And I remember I'm like, kind of pouring my heart out to him as far as just like, oh my God, I don't know what I'm going to do. I need this money. My rent is coming up. I need to buy groceries, da, 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 da. And I remember admitting to having done it in the past, but obviously not admitting to the fact that the checks were fraudulent. So I said, oh, this has happened before and I've had friends help me out. Would you be willing to do this? And there was no question in his mind. It was just like, yeah, write me a check. Let's go. Like it was night. And so I was at night and I remember him being like, tomorrow morning, first thing, we'll go to the bank and deposit it. We'll get you your money. You'll be able to pay your rent. And then it was like, great.
So what was the angle here? So like you would write a check knowing full well that you had no money in your account. He would cash it in for you. And then the two banks would talk to each other later, and his bank could be like, hey, I need this money. And your bank could be like, we don't have it. And then it would come back, it would bounce back to him.
Exactly. And that's the other thing that's so messed up about writing bad checks for the victims is that ultimately they're the ones who become responsible for the money. It's not necessarily the person who wrote the bad check. And to be honest, I don't know if I realized that at the time. That was something that later on I discovered. But either way, the sort of impetus to paying these banks back was on him. And so one day I get a call from him and he was panicked. And he said, I don't know what's going on. We need to figure this out. My bank is coming after me for this money because apparently your checks bounced. And I recall that it wasn't accusatory. It wasn't like they're calling me because you don't have the money necessarily. It was more of like, something's off. Don't know what's going on. We need to figure this out. I was like, oh my God, I don't know what's going on. This is definitely so, like, of course they would do this. Of course there would be this mistake. Like, they're always, trying to pull one over on the little guys. And so we went to the bank together. And I remember my stomach was,
bank.
Yeah, that's like it's one of those things where people are like, oh, she was too smart for her own good. And I was like, no, I was not thinking at all. Like, I wasn't plotting. I wasn't planning. This was everything, all of these decisions were so fly by the seat of my pants. It was all really crimes of opportunity. And so my grand idea was that we were going to go into the bank together to talk to them, to figure out what was going on. And miraculously, somehow, it did work out in my favor because we went to the bank and I was just able to spin this tale in a way that the customer service, like, bank teller representative who was helping us at the end of it all believed me.
What did you say?
I remember just saying, like, this has happened before. The money is supposed to be there. I can't remember the exact details, but definitely a lot of, I think, what master manipulators do, not to say that I am a master at it, but just something that people do is use a lot of words to say very, very little. And so, I'm staying calm and collected, but also have an air of panic, which was true. But she was speaking on the phone to her higher ups, and at the end of the day, she was like, "We're gonna get this all figured out. Don't you worry, honey." And it was kind of like,
Nice.
and I was like, "Wow, we're at a bank. I'm here in front of this person. I'm doing this thing. Maybe I'm better at this than I ever could have imagined."
So did you get away with this? How did it end?
Yeah, so the bank came after him for the money.
Right.
And we had broken up, and I remember he messaged me and called me a few times and was like, you need to take care of this. You need to help me take care of this. Like, they want to take me to court. It wasn't just like we're going to close your account down. It was it had real long-term effects to his life. And this is not this person, but I'm so grateful that I have many people in my life who are my friends, but who were my victims. And I've talked to them at length about some of these things. And one of the most heartbreaking things that someone told me was, they were like, that after all of this happened, I wasn't able to have a bank account for 2 years. He was like, I had to have one of those like baby, bank account debit card type situations where it was like, I had to like preload it. Like, I couldn't get a credit card. I couldn't, apply for loans. And that's just the thing that I had never thought of. And so when I found that out, after I like rekindled this relationship with this person, it was just like, oh my gosh, like, which is, just horrible for so many reasons. But these these actions, it didn't just stop with, my betrayal of their trust.
Yeah.
It literally affected the opportunity for this person to like buy a car, and that's not a thing. That's not a thing that I ever thought of or connected even into my, reformative adult years until I, started having these conversations with these people. It was like, yeah, all of that is to say that the banks went after him, and ultimately, yeah, he had to pony up that money.
Damn.
Yeah.
Okay, so just at a rough guess, like through this period, how many people do you think you screwed over, and like roughly how much money do you think you'd have costed them?
Yeah, so this was in Utah. So this was again when the victims were all people who I knew and who cared about me. And I would say that it was probably around 5 to 6 people. And it was probably around like $2,000
Okay.
total.
It's not huge.
It's not huge. And this is the thing, right? Where again, it's like the monetary amount, we focus on it so much, but then it's like, well, how much money did they actually end up owing the banks? Because if they are not able to pay that, I'm sure there was interest involved. I'm sure, and so it's like these crimes, it just doesn't stop where you think it might.
Yeah. 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 So I imagine you lost a lot of friendships through this period, and then the law caught up with you. You spent some time in prison. Can you tell me about that?
So I ran myself out of Utah. Utah is a very small, Utah has a very small population, especially Salt Lake City, and especially when you have any interest in a subculture. So for me, it was music, tattoos, et cetera, et cetera. And so I literally ran myself out of town because obviously word spread that I was doing these things to these people, to my friends, and no one wanted to have anything to do with me, understandably.
Understandable.
And so I then was like, all right, I am getting out of here. I was arrested in Utah, and it was a very, very brief stint. I mean, it was basically a slap on the wrist, like, you need to take care of this, here are your court dates, whatever. And I was like, all right, I'm getting out of here. And again, this is like a testament, I think, to my inability to be future forward thinking, because I was like, my response to that is that I'm going to leave the state of Utah and I'm going to go where I've always wanted to go, which is New York City. And so,
very nice.
Yeah, moved to New York. But, the intent was, okay, well, I'm leaving Utah. I am going to take this opportunity to, to become who I've always wanted to be, which is not a scammer, which is not a criminal, which is just a person who gets to express themselves and immerse themselves in culture. And so the first few months of living in New York, that's exactly what I did. I had this idea, though, that I would be able to get a job, that I would be able to carve my path much quicker and more easily than I was able to. And so at a certain point, it was like, okay, I ran out of money. I need money.
Yeah.
What am I going to do? I didn't want to revert back to writing bad checks for a number of reasons. I did. That's not to say that I didn't, but that wasn't the main get. Basically, what ended up happening is that I would go to these bars and I would meet these guys and I would write them these silly little stupid notes with come-ons. And, I remember I was at one of the bars watching a show, and I remember there was a guy that had caught my eye earlier in the evening, and he was with someone. He was with a girl, and so I was like, okay, because throughout all of this, I was never a homewrecker.
Okay.
It seems silly to point that out, but there was this weird kind of fucked up code of morals that I had.
Sure.
I was never wanting to ruin someone's existing relationship or anything like that. And then I saw them again after the show, and they were alone. And then I saw them talk to another girl, and I was like, okay, so maybe let's see. So I write this note, and it said something silly. I mean, there were a lot of silly lines that I had, but let's just say the note said, I want you to give me a massage from the inside.
Okay.
And I remember sauntering up to him and like handing him this note. And I mean, what a weird thing to happen. So obviously a look of confusion. And then I was like, I'm going to be mysterious. So I would hand the note to this person, slide it over the bar, whatever it was, and then leave, and then I would go and like find a spot where I could watch them kind of, open this note and look at it and be like, what is happening? And then whether or not they laughed or smiled, that's when I would know, like, okay, this person is like on the level. This is a person that I, again, would want to spend time with. Like, they think that I'm funny. We have some sort of shared, ridiculous sense of humor. And I remember he laughed and I was like, ha, great. And so later on, I like went back up to him and I was like, so what do you say? Like, and I remember his response had something to do with like, oh, well, shouldn't you be the one giving me a massage? And at the time, part of my, I guess, defense was, I don't know, there were so many things about me being Asian. And by no means am I trying to say like, oh, this made everything okay, or this was the reason that this happened. But I remember just being taken with the fact that I was like, oh, this is where this is going.
Yeah.
And so I remember I went home with him and nothing happened that night. I was like, oh, this person's pretty cool. Like, and they have a nice apartment and like, yeah, let's chill, but he was a repeat. And so we did, I guess, for all intents and purposes, started dating. And I would, every time that I went to his place, take something from it. And it
just
was
like a small physical thing.
A small physical thing. It could be anything. I mean, I remember taking, an iPod. So fucked up thing about that iPod is that it had an inscription on the back that I didn't realize until afterwards that was like a congratulations for graduating college.
Oh,
it was
no.
it was like you did it, like you did this thing. And I just...
Was this guy rich? Sorry to interject. Was he like a trust fund baby?
Yeah. And a lot of them were. And I can't say that I didn't. I wasn't not looking for that. There were little tells. There were things that, everything from like, obviously
like
within
shoes.
The apartment, but shoes for sure. There were times that at the bar, like I'd watch someone go to the ATM and if they didn't take their receipt or if they just like crumpled it up and like tossed it on the ground or whatever, I would go and look at the receipt.
It's very observant.
Yeah. And again, it was like, a lot of these things were not necessarily planned. It was just like I would notice that it was happening. I was like, well, yeah, I'm going to go look and see how much money they have. And so this person had a very nice apartment, especially for at the time, being a younger person. They lived by themselves. That was a big one. And I remember actually asking at the bar, I was like, oh, so yeah, they basically insinuate that, yes, they want me to come home with them. I was like, oh, well, is there a time when your roommate's not going to be there? And I was like, oh, well, I live by myself. And that, of course, was like winning the lottery, right?
Wow.
It's like the heavens parted and like the chorus of angels, and so, yeah, this person was definitely being taken care of, and they were a photographer and not a very good one. And so they were definitely being taken care of by people who were not themselves. And I think that there's definitely something about that for me, where it was like, oh, these people seeing that immense level of privilege, in a way where it wasn't really recognized by them in any way. This person I remember specifically still complained about their shitty apartment when it was the nicest apartment I'd ever seen. They were constantly complaining about things. And I remember that they complained about stuff so frequently that I had lost interest pretty early on. But again, I was like, well, every time I go over, for whatever reason, there's just like this stack of money. I'm definitely going to take some of that.
Hey, we're just going to stop here for a quick ad break, but stick around. We'll be right back with more What It Was Like. So this guy would just have cash lying around the house.
Cash, and I don't mean like bricks of cash. It wasn't like stacks of, hundreds of bills or anything.
Wasn't
but
crime.
Definitely just like, when you get home and you empty your pockets and you throw it, on the next to the door. But he also, for whatever reason, just had there was an excess of stuff. And so what I remember was like, wow, this person has so many things that they've never asked me about any of the stuff that I've taken. It was never like, oh, I lost my iPod, but I do remember it being here and I remember you being here that same time. And so I do wonder, was it because of that they trusted me? Very well could be. Or was it because they just had so many things they just didn't care, or they didn't think about it, or they could just buy another one? So yeah, that went on for a few weeks. And I would say that, it was one of those things too, where it was like the sex was really good. So that was a perk for both of us.
Yeah.
But there was some weird Asian shit. It was very strange. And so I think that part of the reason that I kept doing that for so long was this kind of like retaliation aspect of it. Like in my mind, I felt like I was being this kind of like fucked up vigilante or something. And ultimately that ended because he started dating someone. He started dating another Asian woman.
Oh,
and
really?
Yeah,
okay.
that was that. So I think in total from that guy, it was probably, it was definitely a few $100s, but it was, took a camera. I remember that was the one that I was like, why has this person not mentioned this? Like, this is like, because again, he was a photographer, allegedly.
Oh, so this was a nice camera. This wasn't just
like
some
a
little
Nikon
digi camera.
Exactly. It was not nothing. It definitely totaled more than all of the cash that I ever took from him. And I remember being like, if he asks about this, I will give it back. At least that's what I was telling myself, right? Is because again, I still had this like weird sense of self where I was like, well, I'm not scamming this person, even though that's absolutely what I was doing. But my thing was kind of like the ask for forgiveness, not permission, right? And so I'm like, if he asks about it, it's not that I was like, oh, I'm going to be like, I took this. It's that I was like, okay, well, my idea would be that I would bring it back into his apartment and put it somewhere so that then the next, whenever he would find it and just think that he like misplaced it. Never once mentioned that camera. So yeah, I definitely, none of this again is a good excuse for doing what I did, but I definitely felt a little bit of kind of like the Robin Hood-esque figure, which was then attributed to me during this time of like media free-for-all. There were a lot of people who, for lack of better words, were like fans of mine because they were like, well, yeah, they're getting what's coming to them.
Yeah, totally.
And so
how many sorry, just a couple of little stats in this sort of part of your life. Like, at a guess, how many of these men do you think you would have ripped off?
Oh boy, I would say, definitely at least 20, if 20? Not more. This was the thing, is
you were pretty busy.
I was pretty busy, in more ways than one. It's so hard to say, and it's one of those things too, where like there are people who contact me sometimes, and they're like, "You stole money from me." And I have to be like, I'm not saying that you're lying, but I'm saying this is totally plausible. I'm just saying I don't remember you. I have no idea who you are. So definitely, it was up there. It wasn't, like dozens and dozens and dozens of people, but it was certainly more than I can count on my hands. And so I was doing all of these things, and then I finally got my dream job, which was at Vice magazine. And, Vice for me represented everything that, first of all, that I thought was cool, but that I wanted to be, which was like edgy, risk takers, a little off color, all of this stuff, right? And by the way, this was 2008. And so by many accounts, they had already sold out. They're already like a major media, media company.
I mean, they had a very serious office with a neon sign out the front in Williamsburg.
Exactly. And that's the office that I worked at. And I mean, how cool for me to be able to be like, yes, I work at Vice magazine, which is everything that I wanted. So for me, it felt like this turning of the page, right? I remember when I got the job, I was like, okay, I don't have to do all of this shady shit anymore. And ultimately what ended up happening is that I, again, had just left Utah without thinking about things. And so I naturally had several warrants for my arrest. And
oh, God.
yes. And what is really interesting is that the warrants for my arrest and all of these charges, they came from the banks because ultimately some of these victims were not able to pay. And so that's when the bank said, okay, well, you know what? And we're seeing a repetitive pattern, right? My name is coming up multiple times. It's not just with this one person, it's with these other people as well. We're gonna go after her. And so I had these warrants out for my arrest that I didn't know about. I had court dates that I may or may not have known about and missed them. And so ultimately, I had been put on a most wanted list. I did not know this. I have issues with being on a most wanted list outside of the obvious reasons of like no one should want to be on a most wanted list.
No.
But, it was kind of like little old me, this like 20-year-old who had written bad checks, but again, not to an enormous degree. I was on a most wanted list next to, murderers, next to people who had like legitimate proper Ponzi schemes. And
got it.
That, was very confusing for me, but whatever the case, Vice figures this out. And so they unceremoniously fired me by writing an article that basically just said, hey, before you hire someone to work for your company, maybe you should Google them because they might be on a most wanted list.
I mean, this was a big viral article at the time.
Yeah,
I remember it. Yeah, I worked at Vice for almost 10 years, and this was just slightly before my time, but I definitely, I was a Vice fanboy, so I read this. I was like, wow, that's so cool. They hired a felon.
Right. And I think that's the thing is that they saw the salaciousness. I mean, it fit into exactly who and what they are. It wasn't like I had a conversation with HR. It wasn't like anyone emailed me or contacted me. It was literally that like I saw the article that everyone else saw that said this person is wanted. And I was just like, oh my God, well, what am I going to do? So it became such a big story too. It, Vice wrote about it first, obviously, but then it was picked up by all of these other outlets. And it got to the point where there were multiple stories about me coming out every day. And, it blossomed into this thing where people were like putting together, I guess, like manhunts for me. There's a website called Gawker, which is now defunct, but, it was a big tabloid.
I remember it fondly.
Yeah, fondly, because it was fun, right? And I think that's what appealed to people about this story is there are a number of things. Again, the time period that it was in, this was really the first like viral scam story. There was a journalist from The Observer who took that Vice article and wrote a much larger story, and they're the ones who coined who bequeathed the moniker the Hipster Grifter. And I mean, props to them as far as just being business minded, because that is so smart. And so it just took off. And the news cycle was so much slower. I think now a story like this, you know, wouldn't have the staying power that it did back then. But this was a thing. And, you know, when you think about hipsters, at the time, it was one of the first times that hipsters had been in the media, beyond it being like, look at these privileged people, you know, kind of, I don't know, moonlighting as like, you know, blue collar people. You know, it was like, oh, this is the first time they were represented in any like legitimate, like negative light. Yeah. And then it's like, oh, the face of that is me, is this person, is this like, you know, young Asian woman covered in tattoos who writes people silly notes about giving them, you know, hand jobs in a bar. Like, it was the perfect storm. And so, yeah, it just became a huge, massive deal. And so I went into hiding. And
you must have enjoyed that, though.
You know, it's weird because I think that I enjoyed the fact that I was like stirring shit up, right? In my mind, and you know, there's definitely stuff that I can't say. Yeah, there are definitely things that I don't know the rhyme or reason for. But what I do know is that all of these people that I was targeting, these victims of mine, you know, they very much represented to me the kind of people that I grew up with, right? All of these white guys who were, you know, objectifying me and fetishizing, you know, like it. And I don't want to say, it's by no means is that me saying that they deserved it. But it is me saying that, like, I do feel like I was triggered in a lot of ways of like, oh, this person just said something to me like, oh, well, I've never had an Asian girl before. And it was like, all right, well, I maybe wasn't going to steal money from you before. But now that you said that, I definitely am.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
You know, like.
Okay, so look, that was very entertaining. I really loved that anecdote. Can we get another one, like someone else pretty rich that you screwed over and you didn't feel too bad about it?
Okay, yes, there was a person who I met while I was working at Vice. And so I wasn't running amok at this time, right? Because again, I was like, I've got this job, I don't need to do this anymore. But we had met at a party for the release of the DVD set for Flight of the Conchords. If that's like setting the stage for the time period.
What a time. Time to be alive.
And I think it's worth noting that I don't drink, and I never have, because I'm allergic. And so a lot of these instances and a lot of these situations that I found myself in, I was dead sober. And everyone else was completely wasted because it was open bar, it was Vice, it was all of these things, right? So I remember this guy comes up to me. We start talking. He's interesting enough, whatever, don't think anything of it. We exchanged information. We texted back and forth a little bit. And then, of course, it was only a mere like 4 or 5 days later that this story comes out. So I just ceased talking and speaking to anyone, basically, anyone and everyone. And about like a week into all of this, I get a text from him and he was like, hey, I heard everything that's going on. Do you need a place to stay? And I was like, interesting. And I, in fact, did need a place to stay. And so I texted back and I was just like, basically, how do I know that you're not going to like give me up to the authorities? And he was like, I would never do that. And I don't know, he gave me some bullshit response, whatever. So ultimately I was like, all right, I'm going to go do this. So I pack my suitcase and I remember being like, well, you got to pay for a cab because I have no money and I'm not schlepping all of this. Like, I'm not getting on public transportation. And he was like, I can do you one better. I will send a car for you.
Wow.
And so he sends like this black, like town car to get me. And I remember being like, oh, this is so like Pretty Woman. Like, I was like, this is like a very fucked up version of Pretty Woman, which was saying something because it ultimately did become this situation where I get there and immediately he like answers the door and like pulls me in and like starts kissing me. And I'm like, whoa, 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 this is not, we never talked about this. We never agreed to this. This is not something that I'm wanting to do. I'm going to get out of here. And it was essentially a situation where it was like, well, you're already here. You're in my place. I'm offering these things. And what isn't going to stop me from calling the authorities on you now? And so, I'm sitting there, wheels spinning and like trying to weigh my options. And I was like, okay. I look around, I'm like, all right, this guy has a lot of stuff. Like there's, I'm thinking like, okay, if I'm going to do this, I obviously have to make this worth my while.
If you're going to steal something, you go large.
I'm going to go large, right? Or at least I'm going to do, I don't know, something has to happen. Yeah. And so again, this is during the peak of everything. So he was like, okay, something that I want to do. And he was like, I know this sounds weird. And again, this person was not, obviously had like ill intent, but was not like I don't remember, I wasn't like fearing for my life or anything, but I remember he was like, okay, this is really weird. He was like, but I have a thing for like infamous people. And he told me about how one of his hobbies is that he writes to people who are in prison. Wow. And so I remember like, alarm bells going off. I was kind of like, this is fucking weird. But again, what am I going to do? But I was like, okay, continue. And he was like, I would love if I can like jerk off in front of you while you read stories about yourself to me.
Wow, that is a very precise request.
Very precise request. And I remember just like laughing because I was like, this is so insane. And he was like, yeah, I know. He was like, I'm not saying that's not insane, but like, is it a yes? Are you going to do it? I was like, okay, well, what are you going to do for me? And he was like, I don't know, what do you want? And I was like, well, I have nothing right now. So I want money. And I also want security that like, this is not going to come back to get me, to bite me. And so he was like, all right, well, what can I do? And I like shelved that. I was like, I don't know what you can do, but yeah, let's do this. Like, let's get it over with. And also I think something that's important to note is that he had 2 bedrooms, which is major in New York City, like, just to have 2 bedrooms. But he was like, one of the things that he had texted me was like, I have a guest room that you can stay in. And so I was like, I need to know that I'm going to be staying in the guest room. And here's where I think like there's this element, this dynamic, this power play, right? Where I'm so hard up for security, safety, a place to stay that it's not even me being like, I'm not going to do this. It's like, okay, I will do this, but you have to promise me that I don't have to like sleep in bed with you, that I'm still going to be able to like get in, be in this room and also does the door lock. And so, yeah, I fucking did it. I did it. And I remember I was like 2 article maximum. I was like, if you can't come within 2 articles, like I'm not reading more than 2 articles about myself.
Can we just drill into this experience for a minute?
Yeah, I've never told anyone this, by the way. Like, I mean, outside of like friends, I've definitely never like talked publicly about it.
Well, thanks for sharing. This is very interesting. Was it hard to concentrate on the page when this guy was jerking off in front of you?
It was really easy because all I wanted to do was concentrate on anything outside of what was actually happening. But right. I think one of the like weirdest parts of the experience was that I had avoided reading anything about myself. Because, I mean, a lot of it was false. Much more of it was true, right? So like throughout all of this, I'm not like reading. Yeah, I read the Vice article. It was very short also. I read the Observer article because obviously that's what kicked it off. But pretty much anything following that, I avoided. And so I remember being like, first of all, it was the first time I was reading some of these things. And I remember like as I'm like reading it and he's doing his thing and I'm like seeing it in my peripheral, you're like, you know, seeing it like in the distance, like furious hand movements. I remember just being like, that's bullshit. Like, that's not what happened. Or they were saying like, oh, she stole $60,000 because my warrants were for $60,000, which there is a difference. And again, I think I keep saying this even though I don't have to. It's not negating the fact that I made really, really horrible, awful decisions. But like, if I had taken $60,000, this would have been, I think, a different story.
Yeah.
And so I remember being like upset about not the situation that I was in, not that there was a dude like beating off in front of me as I read about myself, but that I was like indignant. I was like upset that they got facts incorrect. And I was like, I thought journalists were supposed to be doing their due diligence. And the guy was like, can you just read? He was like, I don't need your commentary.
So you were saying this out loud.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that I was
you
like
were totally
making faces
killing his buzz.
and like, exactly. He was like, come on, there's a... So I finished reading the articles. He finished everything. We all finished our jobs.
Yeah.
And then I did stay over that night. And I remember being like, this is not, what am I doing? Like, I'd rather go live in this roach infested apartment than here with this weirdo. But I did like go through things. And I remember this was probably one of the only times, at least that I can remember, where I was like, this person should know better, that if I'm staying in this room, they should know that I'm going to look through things. Like, I had never like justified stuff like that before, but I remember being like, well, I'm going to go through all this shit. It was like a guest room / office. And so it had, you know, I mean, like his computer was there, a desk, all these drawers, and they were unlocked. So I'm like going through them and I'm like looking at things. And I did find stuff, but I didn't take, there were things that I found that I didn't take. I never took anyone's like social security numbers, credit cards, anything like that. But I did steal a book of checks that I ended up never using. But I did take a book of checks from him, and they were from his business. They weren't his checks. He was, lo and behold, a small business owner. Really? And I took a thumb drive, not because it was, you know, worth any money or anything, but because I was like, ooh, I wonder what's on here.
Yeah.
It's like the stupidest shit. And then I did take from the front room as I was leaving the next day, I took this like paperweight. It was like a glass sphere paperweight that had flowers suspended in it. Definitely, I don't think anything of value.
I mean, it sort of feels to me like a continuation of the game that you were playing in high school, where you're just like stealing stuff for its like anecdotal value rather than any sort of monetary gain.
1,000%. I've never thought about it like that. But truly, and I mean, I have to say, even though I was like, this guy's a fucking weirdo, there was definitely that aspect of like, well, add it to the list of crazy shit that has happened to me. Yeah, you know, add it to the list of experiences. And then the best part of the story is that this person ultimately ended up being someone of note. And I will not oust them, but it is a person who, at least in the US, if I said their name, people would know who they are.
They're like an actor or like celebrity or like a politician? Or... They
are a business person who had disrupted, quote unquote, an industry with with a product that they had created.
Was this like the CEO of Uber or something in 2009?
It wasn't, but another crazy story of things that have happened in my life, and I think a lot of it is too that like chaos attracts chaos, right? Whether that chaos be like criminal chaos or just by nature, which is where I fall. I did work for Adam Newman, who is the founder of WeWork. And fucking Vivek Ramaswamy, who I don't know how into American politics name. You are, but he ran for president, but then became part of Trump's became part of all of that. And both
Yeah.
of those people are prolific scammers. And this was after I had got out of jail and, was just trying to live a normal life and have legitimate employment. And both of them had figured out who I was, even though my actual employment was all above board. They had my social security number, they had all of my information, my record had been expunged, but they had Googled me, figured out who I was, and fired me. And so then, a few years later, when all of their stuff comes out, it's just like, how rich is that?
Hey, we're just going to stop here for a quick ad break, but stick around. We'll be right back with more What It Was Like.
The new Boost Mobile network is offering unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for life.
That sounds like a threat.
Then how do you think we should say it?
Unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month for the rest of your life?
I don't know.
Until your ultimate demise.
What if we just say forever?
Okay.
$25 a month, forever.
Get unlimited talk, text, and data for just $25 a month with Boost Mobile forever.
After 30 gigabytes, customers may experience slower speeds. Customers will pay $25 a month as long as they remain active on the Boost Unlimited plan.
So how did you eventually come undone? How did you end up in prison?
Okay, so I was like, all right, something has got to give. Like, I can't live like this anymore. Because again, my options at the time were roach-infested apartment without electricity, or fancy guest room of man who forces me to watch him jerk off.
The masturbator.
Like, the two options were neither of them were like the most palatable. But also I was like, how am I going to live any sort of life? And I was young, I was like early 20s. So like I had the wherewithal to know like, okay, well, I have a lot of life ahead of me. So I do need to take care of this. And I did want to take care of it. I wanted it to be over. Basically, I took a bus to Philadelphia and was met by several police officers who arrested me. And so I was in a Philadelphia detention center for about 30 days until the state of Utah sent 2 detectives to handcuff me and put me on a plane to fly me back to Utah. And, so much of what I do now, I'll be brief, but so much of what I do now is to bring awareness to our judicial system. And I really wonder how much money the state of Utah spent, to do all of these things and to get me back there, when, again, my crimes, all in all were relatively pithy in comparison to others. So I get to Utah, and that's really where like the long stint began. And so in total, I did almost a year. I think the most meaningful experiences for me were not in, I do consider myself, I am reformed. I truly believe that I will never go back. I will never be incarcerated again. But the parts of me that are reformed are not because I went to jail. They're 1,000% because of the people I met there and all of these amazing women who I saw who have just been completely knocked down and there's no way for them to get back up. There's no way to, quote unquote, pull yourselves up, by your bootstraps if you don't even have boots to begin with. And yeah, there's so much to say about it. Yeah.
I mean, realistically, it'd be like a whole other podcast. I think we could probably do a part 2 on like incarceration with Kari. Yeah. But I mean, I think suffice to say that you describe yourself as reformed. You've done a lot of reflecting. And I'm really keen to dive into some questions. These are just questions that I've always had around lying, grifting, manipulation, fraud, in all sort of ways. And that's to say that, like, when I see these cases, when I hear about your story, I think to myself, like, that kind of sounds fun. Like, it certainly sounds exciting. But, like, I just don't know if I could live with the stress, you know, the sort of the constant stress all the time of like, am I going to get found out? Like this is going to totally sink my credibility. I don't know. I just sort of like an open question. Did the stress eat away at you?
For sure. That being said, I think that for me in particular, obviously can't speak for others. For me, being raised Mormon and looking, again, I know I keep talking about the way that I look, but the reason that I say that is because there are actual scriptures that the Mormon church has within their, what I call like Jesus fanfic, because it's like they're, you know, they follow the Bible, but then they also have their own, and they have their own books.
I think fanfic is pretty accurate.
Yeah, Jesus fanfic. And they say things like, you know, that people of color are cursed, that it's a mark that they've been given, you know, that they are dark and loathsome. And so there's that part of it, but there's also the part that I am a queer woman. So all of these things, my entire life felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop and that I was going to be caught and that I was running away from something and that I was bad. So it certainly was a heightened version of that, but it was not that uncommon from all of the feelings I had my entire life up until that point.
Okay. And did you ever, I think the other thing that I always get stressed about in these situations where if I find myself exaggerating or just sort of fudging the details a little bit, I'm immediately thrown into this like, this feeling of like, oh God, I'm not going to be able to keep up with my own bullshit. I'm not going to be able to like work sort of 4 moves ahead so that I don't trip myself up or tangle myself up. Did you have any techniques to sort of try to keep the story straight in your own head or to like try to avoid that problem?
I mean, it is exhausting, right? And I mean, that's why it's just easier to not lie because there are so many things to keep track of. I think that I ultimately succeeded in my post-incarceration life as a digital marketing director because I had always project managed my entire life.
Oh, really?
Like, it's not like I had spreadsheets or anything, but there definitely were you know, there were like certain things where I was like, okay, I'm never going to lie about this thing because, for example, like parts of my childhood or like my adoption story or things like that, because I don't want them to reflect poorly like on my parents, you know, or I'm never going to lie about dates, like specific dates and times, because I'm never going to remember those. So it was more of like the knowing myself and knowing sort of like my ADHD brain and how I wouldn't be able to, you know, even if I had like memorized things, there's no way I would be able to keep all of those details straight. I don't know if there were any like tips and tricks outside of just like the more truthful the lie was, the better. Like the and I do think that that's a tactic that I used though, which was that there were very few things that I lied about that were just straight up 100% lies. There was always the infusion of some truth. And that was definitely by design, right? That's so it's easier to remember, but it's also so that you can speak to that thing, you know, and you do have a connection to that thing. And, you know, some people's bullshit radar, some people's, you know, bullshit meters are finely tuned. I always tried to, again, it was always still me. And I don't know what that says. I don't know, you know, if that's like a good thing or a bad thing, but throughout all of it, so much of the lies were still very much rooted in some sort of truth. Yeah.
And did you ever get like I call it like a sort of ickiness, like when I find myself not telling the truth, it feels a bit icky to me. Like it's a sort of like I need to have a bit of a shower feeling. Did you ever have that?
I think that's because your moral compass is calibrated correctly. So good for you.
Well done, buddy.
Well done. No, truly though. I mean, certain parts of it did for sure, right? Yeah. The fallout of it felt incredibly icky. while doing it. But yeah, every night I'm just like, oof, man, that was fucked up. Like, how could I do this to people?
Is there one that sticks in your mind? You know, like sometimes I'll just think back to, you know, something I said at the age of 16 to my girlfriend at the time, or, you know, just some sort of like personal disgrace that I like. Do you have moments at like 4 a.m. where like a particular moment will just pop out of your subconscious and you're like, oh God, I did that?
Yes. And I don't, you know, the thing is, I don't know that it's even the subconscious. I think it's very much living within my conscious at all times, and conscious and conscience. Like, the worst thing that I did by far, and I did it to multiple people, was lying about having cancer. Like, that is just like fucked up beyond belief. I mean, and you know, it's like, well, what was the point of that? It was definitely...
Well, why did you do that?
Yeah, I mean, the attention, right? Of course. And it was like the attention with such high stakes, right? Because you can say that you're sick or you have some, it was, but specifically, it was like, oh, this is at a point where, and I mean, I think this is a thing. I've heard a lot of people say, like, this is the one thing that I would never be able to forgive her for. Or like, there are people who are like, yeah, it's great that she's like trying to be better or whatever, but fuck her because she did this thing. And I can't disagree with that.
When
yeah,
was
that's
this
something that haunts me.
In the chronology, when was your cancer thing?
Mostly when I was in New York. Yeah,
mostly in New York.
Like,
okay. It was after all the grifting and the vice experience.
No, it was before that. Yeah, so it was like before. It was during the grifting experience.
During the grifting phase.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And I mean, that was part of it.
And you tell men, particularly, and friends that you had cancer?
Yes, but you know what? That was like such an aside, honestly, because the men that I was taking stuff from, they were kind of like single serving, you know, outside of like the person that I mentioned that I did see for, you know, for a few weeks. But it was really, that one was, you know, I don't know what it is, but it's like the worst things I ever did were to the people who actually cared and who were my friends. And so, that it initially started, there was a woman who I had this crush on, and I was just like so in love with her, and she was a very good friend of mine. And so I never knew if she was interested in women or not. And I never asked, but she started dating this guy, and it got really, really serious. And I remember it got serious to the point where she was going to meet his family. And I was like, this can't happen. Like, and first of all, who the fuck am I to say whether that can happen or not? Yeah. Second of all, I'm supposed to be her friend. I should be happy for her that she has found a person that she wants to take this next step with, right? So there are all of these things that are just, you know, that I'm not doing, that I should as a friend be doing. But I freaked out, and I was like, I guess, like, you know, I don't remember thinking of it like, I can't let this happen. But ultimately what did happen is that I lied about having cancer so that she would come and spend time with me at the hospital versus meeting this person's family. So
wait,
like,
at the hospital? How were you at the hospital if you didn't actually have cancer? Because
it's easy to manipulate anyone and everyone. But also, you go into a hospital and you say, I have all of these things that are happening to me. They're internal things. It takes time for them to parse out whether or not you're lying, right? In fact, there was a moment where I actually legitimately did think that something was wrong with me after lying to get into the hospital, because they found all of these things that were wrong with me when they were doing these scans. And so, yeah, I mean,
did that feel icky? That must have felt icky. You must have been sitting in that bed being like, oh,
yes,
God.
That felt icky. That was maybe one of the only things that I did where at the time I was just like, oh my God, what the fuck am I doing?
What am I doing?
And because, again, like, it didn't start with nothing. It wasn't like I was like the pinnacle of health, right? And then like going in the hospital and being like, I was sick. And so I remember just being like, I remember I stayed overnight in the hospital. That was like the whole thing, right? Is that I was there for a few days. And I remember just being like, this is what what am I doing? This is miserable. And then also like more morphine, please.
Yeah.
Because I was like, I just got to knock myself out because this is like heinous. But yeah,
I'm
that's
guessing.
lying about illnesses is by far the worst thing that I've ever done. And even if the amount of money that I had taken was tenfold, 100-fold, that would still be the worst because that is, a different level of manipulation. Like to me, yeah, it's all not good. It's all, but that is, that's on another level. So, oof, yeah, I very much, that's the thing that keeps me awake
That's
at
the thing
night.
you regret. How's that friendship these days?
So
To that woman.
But non-existent and haven't been
Non-existent,
since.
yeah.
The other thing is that this story, like, though it lasted a decent amount of time, everything happened in a very short period of time.
Right, yeah.
So I would say that, like, that situation was maybe like a month and a half, 2 months before everything blew up.
Got it.
And I remember getting texts from people when the story came out of just being like, what the fuck? Who are you?
Yeah.
Have you been lying to us about everything? Also, bitch, do you even have cancer? Like yeah. So
Yeah, that's the thing I think I need to be liked by people. I think it's something about me. I suspect you like to be liked as well.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
when you get outed for faking cancer, it's a really good way to sink your own social status. And I guess that would have hurt.
1,000%. Yeah, and I think that the thing about being a people pleaser and being liked is that at a certain point, sometimes it surpasses obviously it surpasses your own better judgment. And again, I didn't think about the fallout or the outcome of pretty much anything that I did.
Look, I've just got a couple more questions, but something I'm wondering about is, so when I look at stories like Bernie Madoff, and just for anyone who doesn't know, Bernie Madoff holds the record for running the world's largest Ponzi scheme. He lost like $1 billion or something of investors' money. But so when I look at these stories, I'm like, that is just incomprehensible to me. Like, I can't imagine being in that world. But from your vantage point, do you look at those kinds of characters and you're like, I can kind of get it, how you'd like go down the slippery slope that far? Does it seem a little more logical to you?
No, it doesn't actually.
Okay.
I think maybe if I were a white guy, I would have a different response.
maybe different characters then. Like the woman in New York who was claiming to be a German heiress was probably a bit
Anna
more in your sort of, Anna Delvey.
Yeah.
Probably a bit more
I think
your speed.
that I can see how someone could get so wrapped up into something that they don't, again, consider other people's feelings or the ultimate outcome. I think that there is a reason, though, for me personally, that it kind of stayed where it was. I don't think that had I not been incarcerated and got caught, I don't necessarily think that I would have built up this like large scale scamming empire. First of all, that's a lot of work. Like so much of what I did was because I'm lazy ultimately, or it was lazy. It was out of laziness, right? And I know I said that it was hard for me to get a job, but that's because I still had this opinion of myself where I'm like, well, I'm not going to get a job at McDonald's. If I had just lowered my own expectations for myself and not had so much of an ego, there were so many better options for me to do what I needed to do, right? What's fascinating for me is how people like Anna and myself, and we have mutual friends, we're like kind of in the same circle, how it's two sides of the same coin. It's like how we can go through a very, very, very similar experience, but be very different people after it all, right? Which is, and this is nothing no judgment against her as far as what she's doing currently. But like my whole thing is like advocacy. And I want to, I started a production company so I could help tell other women of color stories. And it's like she goes and is on Dancing with the Stars, which get your bag, whatever. But, it's like, is she apologetic? Is she sorry? And then we as a society, does it matter to us really? Does it? Does it matter that she says that she's sorry? You're still going to watch her on Dancing with the Stars. You might love to hate her, but you're still loving her in a way, I definitely can see, though, the greed, right? If you're talking about like a Madoff or whatever, it's just like at a certain point, nothing is ever going to be enough. I just think that it's interesting that because now it's like my greed is like, ooh, how many people can I help? Like, how many stories can I get out there? How much money can I raise for this organization? If I had a portfolio of 10,000 people that I was able to directly affect in a positive way, like that's so much fucking cooler than, oh, I have a bank account that has, $10 million in it. Like, I mean, both would be great, but...
Yeah. I mean, let's put it all together. So a really simple question, which is probably hard to answer, is like, why did you do this?
Yeah, that's hard to answer. I don't know that I'll ever fully know. I think the best thing, the best that I can give is because of, at the time, my own insecurities and my own ego and my own, like, confusion around who I am as a person. And now, it's like I guess it's a double-edged sword having a story like this, right? So in finding that people are interested in what I have to say, it feels like a disservice to not utilize that in some way, toward moving the needle toward a more compassionate society in some way.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's what drew me to you at the start, is your ability to be honest and self-reflective about this stuff. Like breaking the law, lying particularly, is a thing where people don't want to own up to it. They're like, oh, it's still sort of the truth in ways that you don't understand. Whereas you're just like, no, I never had cancer. That wasn't a misunderstanding. I just made it up.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Is it hard for you to sort of be straight about this stuff? Is it hard for you to sort of reflect on this and just be self-reflective and straight with me?
It's way harder to lie. Like it's way harder, and it's way more, it takes way more bandwidth to lie too, for all of the reasons that we've already talked about. But like, no, I mean, for better or worse, I'm an open book.
Well, Kari, look, this has been amazing. This has been so interesting, and I really appreciate all of your honesty. Yeah,
Thank you.
It feels to me like you've done a full 180, where your method before was to be interesting was to be full of shit, whereas these days you're very interesting because you're completely honest, and that's a good thing.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed today's conversation, you should absolutely check out Kari's memoir. It's called You'll Never Believe Me, A Life of Lies and Second Tries, and it's just come out. Kari dives into so much more stuff than we could squeeze in today, and she's really funny. She's a sharp writer. That's You'll Never Believe Me. Check it out. Today's episode was produced by Rachel Tuffery. It was mixed by Jimmy Saunders, who also did our theme music. A big thanks to our interns, Nina Fussell and Ellie Dickey. And thanks to Jim, Subro, and Sunita at Toothcomb, which is this amazing AI-powered research company, and they're helping us to find stories. So thank you, Toothcomb. And this whole thing has been a Super Real production.
When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof like Ello or Allbirds or Skims, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and brilliant marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the business behind the business, making selling simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does selling better than Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret, with Shop Pay that boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going. So if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/try to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/try.